What's up everyone, it's Wizard101 back again with another Wiz video, and today I just want to do a quick ranking of each world by difficulty. I'll be ranking the worlds by how difficult they are at the point in the game where you get to them, because obviously a level 40 wouldn't be able to do Polaris, but level 40 may find Dragonspyre more challenging than Polaris at level 100 if that makes sense. If you enjoyed the content, please consider leaving a like or a sub. With all that being said, let's get right into the video. Now, the easiest world in the game has definitely got to be Wizard City. It's an introductory world that's really short and sweet, and you honestly aren't going to have much of a problem unless you're a wizard in the backstreets of Chicago like me. Jokes aside though, you should have a really easy time questing through Wizard City. You might get low in fights like Lord Nightshade, but as long as you have Heartbeat, you should be chilling. It's pretty standard for an introductory world in the game, and was never really meant to be difficult in the first place. The world has 39 quests overall and only has 6 bosses. Next up we have Marleybone. You may notice that a lot of Arc 1 worlds are low on this list, and it's because in my opinion the progression and difficulty in the first arc is very linear, with each world being harder than the last in a lot of cases, or at least the worlds being very relative to each other. Marleybone is still on the easier side of the worlds though, with most of the difficulty coming from the dungeon of Ironworks, which is a very long dungeon with multiple boss fights. The final dungeons, especially Big Ben, also add on to the difficulty a lot, with a ton of mob fights before the final boss fight against Meow Yardy. Next up we have Krokotopia. I think it's slightly more difficult than Wizard City and Marleybone, but overall it's not too difficult still. Krok is a very chill and short world without a lot of challenges. There are no real memorable bosses besides Krokopatra when it comes to difficulty, to be honest, but the main thing is that there are a lot of these unmemorable bosses, over 30 to be exact, which is kind of insane jumping from Wizard City to Krok, as Wizard City has 6 bosses and Krok has over 30. This world can also be a bit harder than Marleybone because of how slow it is when you don't have your AoE until later in the world at least, but I still wouldn't consider it very difficult. You may die a few times depending on the school you use, but it's perfectly solvable and you should be able to finish it in a few hours max. The world has a total of 65 quests and 36 bosses. Next up we have Mooshu. Mooshu is a very fair world when it comes to difficulty in my opinion. I think that could be kind of annoying to play at certain points, but that's less of a difficulty thing and more of me just not liking the really outdated graphics. The bosses have a decent amount of health, and the final fight, the Jade Oni, is decently challenging for the level. A lot of the boss fights are put into 2 dungeons, the Yoshihito Temple and the Shirataki Temple. 2 dungeons that are decently challenging because of the level you are when you reach them. Boss fights take a while as you need to buff a lot to kill them. The ratio of bosses to quests is also really solid, with 88 quests and 28 bosses, and even though there are less bosses here than in Krokotopia, I still think it's much more difficult for where you are in the story when you get there. Jumping into Arc 3 for a minute, we have Polaris. Polaris is a very easy world at the time where you start questing in it. You go from Khrysalis and Azteca with bosses averaging between 15k to 20k health, to a large majority of bosses here having below 10k health. There are some cheating bosses you need to worry about, but all the fights are pretty easy, and if you have Darkmoor gear, then the mobs and bosses really can't do much of anything against you here unless you're on a harder school like Balance, but even then it's pretty easy. I generally think that Polaris was made easier on purpose just to kind of start off an arc and respond to criticism players have of Azteca and Khrysalis being too hard or the boss having too much HP, and it really is much easier than most worlds in the game. The only real difficult fight is Rasputin, otherwise known as the Rat, but if you're not dedicated to soloing this final fight, you could easily find a team up and demolish it with some help. Polaris has 98 quests with 38 bosses, 7 of them having cheats. Overall, a very easy world to be honest. Not too much more difficult than Polaris, we have Mirage. Now Mirage is a special case because it used to be very difficult when it first released back in like 2016. When I got back into the game a few years ago, I actually watched Sauce's playthrough, and the mobs had a lot of health, y'all, I'm not gonna lie. This is not true of Mirage in the modern day, however, with bosses having below 10k health for the most part, and some not even reaching 5k, which honestly baffled me on stream, because in terms of difficulty, that's just way too easy in my opinion. What happened with Mirage is that a lot of people complained about the difficulty and KI nerfed it into the ground basically, and I think they nerfed it a bit too hard, but I digress. It's slightly more difficult than Polaris in my opinion because it has a more difficult cheating bosses like the Mangoose Trio and Melange the Worm, and the ending part with the Shadow Walk, Shadow Bones, and Grandfather Spider are all pretty difficult in comparison to the rest of the world, and it gave Mirage an edge in terms of difficulty in comparison to Polaris at least. Mirage has 115 quests with 58 boss fights, 29 of them having cheats. The number may be intimidating, but a lot of these bosses have below like 5k health, so they're really not that difficult. Next world on the list is Dragonspyre. I think that Dragonspyre is when difficulty picks up a bit for the game. There are a few more boss fights than there are in Mooshu, and a lot of mob fights which adds on to the challenge of it a little bit. I feel like the bosses in Dragonspyre are also much harder than the ones in Mooshu, with a lot of them having significantly more health than Mooshu bosses, and a really challenging dungeon to solo in the case of the Labyrinth. The final dungeon, the Great Spire, also has some interesting puzzles and a good amount of boss fights surmounting Malister, who, while he isn't as challenging as he used to be, the dungeon as a whole is still interesting, and the fight is still much harder than the Jade Oni in my opinion. Dragonspyre has a total of 106 quests with 35 bosses, and it also has 39 mob fights in total, so be prepared for the grinds. Now we have Zafaria. Zafaria is the second world in Arc 2, and before you get water breaks, the world can be a bit challenging at some points. Especially in the beginning where you'll have bosses with decent health for the level critting on you, and it could generally stop your questing at certain points. Zafaria doesn't have many bosses though relative to the quest amount, which is what stops it from being high on this list. A large majority of the quests are just mob fights with defeat and collects, and a lot of these bosses just get clumped together in quests instead of being spread out, which makes a lot of the world kind of just boring mob fights. I think Zafaria can be decently challenging at some parts, like the bosses in the Elephant Graveyard, and Mirror Lake if you're soloing can be very challenging for this level, but to be honest, I think the world just becomes very easy after you get Waterbricks gear. Overall, the world has 148 quests with 24 bosses and 6 cheating bosses overall. I think it's kind of middle of the road in terms of difficulty. The game is starting to get a little bit harder, but it's not really that difficult. Next, we have Novus. Now honestly, I remember thinking this world was kind of difficult on release, but that was mainly because I was a noob and didn't know about how important socketing Pierce was for this world. But once I farmed 40 Thieves and actually got good Pierce on my character, this world was very easy. The bosses have low health, and while there are some cheating bosses, the cheats would usually be very easy to counter once you knew them. The change from you not really having to worry about bosses having universal resist to virtually every boss and mob having it definitely added on to the difficulty, but if you caught on to what you needed to do to circumvent this, the world was very easy in comparison to the rest of Arc 4, and even a lot of Arc 2. The most challenging fights of this world are definitely Don Manzana, Design's Duelist, and of course the Aeon of Advance's fights. Don Manzana and Design Duelist are perfectly soloable, but you may struggle with them. The Aeon fight you will need a full team for, but the fight itself is more annoying and long rather than challenging in my opinion. The world has a total of 88 quests with less than 20 bosses, so it honestly should be light work. Next up is Lemuria. Honestly, a lot of Lemuria's challenge was kind of lost after they nerfed the final boss fight into the ground. There are still some memorable and challenging bosses in the forms of Morg the Merciless as well as the Malagast. These fights can be very annoying to solo and are definitely a step up from fights in other worlds. Another thing about Lemuria is that the bosses hit really hard, so just be careful about that. The world has a total of 101 quests overall and about 20 bosses, so it's definitely not unreasonable for the level. Overall, I think it's a decently challenging world. Next up is Celestia. Now Celestia is a pretty big jump in difficulty from Dragonspyre, to be honest. It introduces critical, which means a lot of bosses will crit on you and you're at a point where Zizgear is getting much weaker and you're nowhere near Waterbricks yet, so you just need to tough it out. The mobs are also much stronger here than they are in Dragonspyre with way more health overall, so it'll be very annoying to kill them. There are also a good amount of dungeons with challenging bosses like the Chancel and the Solarium. The Trial of Spheres, the final dungeon, can also be very annoying to beat, especially solo, with you having to beat multiple challenging bosses, each with their own set of unique challenges. Honestly though, I really like this difficulty jump from Dragonspyre, and I think it's a decently challenging world for the level. The world has a total of 95 quests with 26 bosses, only 3 of them are cheaters and they're all in the final dungeon. Next up is Karamelle. Now Karamelle may appear all sweet and easy, but once you get there, don't let that fool you. Some bosses here will screw you up. Overall, in terms of the mobs in the world, it's pretty straightforward and easy. There are a lot of easy bosses sprinkled across the world. However, every once in a while, you will come across a boss that will make you want to uninstall the game as a solo player. Difficult fights just pop out of seemingly nowhere with cheating bosses like the Bundozer, Judge Veg, King Gobsmack, the Paradox at the end. Heck, even the fights like Copycat and Quake Charmer can be annoying at some points. I feel like a lot of people skip over Karamelle because they don't think it's as hard as Empyrea, which don't get me wrong, I think Empyrea is harder too, but Karamelle does have some genuinely hard fights that could be annoying to quest through. Like bro, I expected to fight some gummy bears and some more robots, not get jumped in a back alley by a gummy bunny with a Glock in Chicago. Jokes aside, Karamelle is definitely not a joke at certain points of the world, and while your average boss or mob fight won't cause you any problems, the difficult bosses are going to give you some trouble. The world has a total of about 88 quests and around 16 or so bosses. Definitely not the hardest world, but some bosses will give you trouble. Now we have Avalon. Avalon can be a decently challenging world with a lot of quests and boss fights overall, and I think the bosses have reasonable amounts of health for the level. Avalon has very memorable bosses like the Jabberwock, Young Marganth, and of course the Pendragon. All these bosses can prove to be challenging in their own ways, and honestly can be pretty fun fights to solo. Avalon has a total of 161 quests, with 43 bosses, so it's definitely a grind. I would say for sure it's one of the hardest worlds in the game. Empyrea is going to be next up on this list. Now Empyrea can be a very difficult world at some points, and it has a lot of quests compared to other Arc 3 worlds and Arc 4 worlds. Part 1 and Part 2 together have around 150 quests and about 40 bosses you need to beat, many of whom cheats. Empyrea is a massive jump in difficulty from Mirage and Polaris, which are very easy in comparison, and I would say it's more difficult than Avalon, which was the last world on the list. There are definitely some fights that you may get stuck on. One of the most memorable areas of Empyrea is definitely Reverie, as you'll have to defeat dream versions of Jabberwock and Belloc and Evil Ambrose. The final boss is the Storm Titan's Trident, is also very memorable. It isn't as hard as it once was, but soloing it can still be very challenging. The world would be much higher on the list, but they've kind of nerfed it over the years, especially with the Medulla change with challenge mode, and even though it could still be a challenge, it's not as hard as it once was, to be honest. Overall, I'd still say it's a pretty challenging world, and it's definitely high up on this list. At the number 4 spot for the most difficult world, I'm going to put in Khrysalis. Now Khrysalis by far is the longest world in the game, but it doesn't have the most bosses. That's going to go to the number 3 spot. Khrysalis definitely has its fair share of challenges though. With 277 quests and 55 boss fights, Khrysalis will take you a little while to complete compared to other worlds. The Warlord fights in particular can be very difficult when you do them solo. Cravenly the Hunter, Ghost Dog, and Lord Umbra in particular are very challenging bosses and interesting to fight. Average bosses in Khrysalis also have pretty good amounts of health, with a lot of them being at around 14k and some having upwards of 20k. The Galleries is also a really difficult dungeon when soloing, same with the Roots with the Moros, and even though the Morganth fight is said to be pretty underwhelming, a 4 boss fight with each one having 20k health is definitely more difficult than anything they had given us up until that point in the game. At the number 3 spot, I'll be putting Azteca. Azteca is the world filled with the most bosses in the game. It has a total of 197 quests and 57 bosses, around 80 less than Khrysalis, but more bosses, which is still insane. The bosses in Azteca are health sponges too. Many of them have upwards of 20k health, definitely much more than bosses in even late game worlds but like Karamelle, Lemuria, or even Novus. At the time you reach Azteca, you don't even have Darkmoor gear, and you'll have to power through the boss's high health bars, which could be a big problem for you, especially if you're not playing a high damage school or high sustainability school. There aren't many specific fights I'd say that are challenging besides the Final Dungeon Shabalba, of course, which can be pretty bad to play through overall. Overall, I think that a lot of the difficulty from the world just comes from having those many high health bosses that can just serve as walls for progression and slowing you down. All of this makes me say Azteca is one of the most difficult worlds in the game. I still wouldn't say it's the most difficult though. The number 2 spot I think is probably Selenopolis. I feel like I did a lot of unique things with the Selenopolis in fights like the Taking Tree, Loon Knight, and Khonsu. A lot of the fights in Selenopolis kind of countered the classic Blade into Fate into Senpip AoE meta, which a lot of players have been asking for, and I think it generally makes for a nice challenge in a lot of cases. At the number 1 spot, the most difficult world in Wiz in my opinion has to be Wallaru. Wallaru was definitely a surprise, as Arc 3 and Arc 4 worlds have been substantially easier than some Arc 2 worlds. What made Wallaru very difficult were the cheating bosses, namely the Urks and Freddy Croaker. The Urk fights were very annoying and you had to solo all of them, and some of the cheats were very annoying to deal with. The worst ones in my opinion were Confusion and Desperation. I had so many times where Desperation would ice gen me right as I was about to hit. It was very, very bad. Wallaru does a lot of things differently than what they have been doing in the previous Arc 4 worlds, and it makes it a very challenging and fun experience overall, culminating in the Nightmare Dungeon, which is still probably the hardest content outside of raids in the game. Overall, a very difficult world, but a very fun one as well. With all that being said, that's it for the video today. Leave your rankings below for which worlds you think are the most difficult. I hope y'all enjoyed watching. Please leave a like or a sub if you enjoyed. I hope y'all have a wonderful rest of your day, and as always, I'll see y'all in the next one. Peace.